poetry then be? And I thought, well, it must mean aesthetics. So that, in other words, what makes a poem, what makes for beauty, and I did a little bit more literary criticism as I was getting my education. I'll have 3 points that I want to make before reading some poems to you, and it's late, and if you'll just bear with me. But there's a widespread use of the term in current popular literature which replicates the era. That is, that meta is beyond or after, and in the chronology that was used to set up Aristotle's works, metaphysics then became what comes after physicality, and therefore becomes a study of the spiritual, as the popular knowledge, popular notion is that it discusses the spirit. And I had a lot of things to tell you about all that, but the final word here is, I'll explain to you why metaphysics is not a good idea, according to Rudolf Carnap in his book Philosophy and Logical Syntax, to reject metaphysics. He says, metaphysics cannot avoid making their statements non-verifiable, because if they made them verifiable, the decision about the truth or falsehood of their doctrines would depend upon experience, and therefore belong to the region of empirical science. This consequence they wish to avoid because they pretend to teach knowledge which is of a higher level than that of empiric science. Thus they are compelled to cut all connection between their statements and experience, and precisely by this procedure they deprive them of any sense. A metaphysical statement usually implies an idea about the world or about the universe which may be reasonable, but is ultimately not empirically testable. So I'm sure that won't be. She's part of my act here because you're going to see that she features heavily in my poem. Here,
Watch out.
how did you do that?
Grab the other end and then that's it. That's it.
All right, now you sit down. Sit. Okay. So the next point I'd like to then talk about is Ars Poetica. There's a beautiful poem by Archie McLeish, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, in trying to answer this question about what makes a poem and what makes a poem beautiful. And his poem, Ars Poetica, I'm sure you know it, but a poem should be palpable and mute like a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless like a flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases twig by twig the night-entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf, for love, the leaning grasses and the two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. And I think it sort of puts its finger on the Dionysian notion that there's something that really transcends rationality. I mean, a good poem rings many bells, and it does it with music, it does it with metaphor, it does it with image, and passion. So that, in this lovely poem...
If I might just say, in my youth, it was always, my friends were always debating between being Dionysian and being Apollonian.
Right.
And they were always going on the side of Dionysius and putting me down for being remotely Apollonian. So, and I there was a certain...
Here's Horace, How to Be a Good Poet, in his, and he says, to answer that very point, because Democritus believed talent a greater blessing than poor old technique, and barred sane poets from Helicon, a good few don't care to trim their nails or beards, haunting secluded spots, shunning the baths. So there you have your beat Dionysian poets, even back from this period. I think that, just to look at this McLeish poem a little longer. So it teaches, as well as art for art's sake, My friend William used to say that a poem fails exactly to the extent that it tries to preach or teach. Of course, there's a whole school of thought, in terms of Vietnam and feminist poetry and the way poetry can, in fact, bring us to social action. In literary criticism, I think we have, the Aristotelian, which is a good poem imitates life. It's true to reality. The socialist school of criticism would argue that it would be like boy meets tractor, boy falls in love with tractor, and they make a lot of grain for the state. That's a good poem that leads you to produce. Another way of looking at it would be expressionism or the lyric poet, and this is where I land, coming from the lyre, of course, and that music should somehow be part of it, but also metaphor. I think that metaphor really is the most important engine which drives poetry. And I think that the capability that a poet has to look at one thing and see another is really key to poetry. And how that happens, I really don't know. I think we were talking back there about the brain and personality and how today people more or less say that the two have to be intertwined, that this dualism of soul somehow out there, or spirit versus body and who we are physically. More and more the two, so that when you talk about having too much wine, it may well be that, or gin or whatever your poison is, it may well be that sets off something. Although most poets will say to you, the night they stayed up with too much pot or something, the next morning they looked at what they thought was really marvelous, and it didn't get water. It was hardly what they...
I think maybe people who drink write better than people who smoke pot.
But it could lead you to another sad situation where here at the end of How to Be a Good Poet, he says, and I think of John Berryman, for example, who managed to jump from the bridge and get himself in. Of the Sicilian poet's death, how Empedocles, keen to be an immortal god, coolly leapt into burning Etna. Grant poets the power and right to kill themselves, for who saves one against his will murders him. It's not his first time, nor if he's rescued will he become human now and stop craving fame and death. It's not too clear why he keeps on making verses. Has he desecrated ancestral ashes, disturbed a sad spot struck by lightning sacrilegiously? Yes, he's mad. Like a bear that's broken the bars of its cage, the pest puts all to flight, learned or not, with reciting. Whom he takes hold of, he grips and reads to death, a leech that never looses the skin till gorged with blood. I think we've all met that kind of poet that just, let me tell you the latest thing. Let me show you this. So as far as poetry goes, in my experience, you have to read, it's what my creative writing teacher said. A poet reads and writes. That's what you do, and you live. And Horace says, take. Hemingway says, write what you know about. And essentially, I think for me, poetry is a lyric process. It's a cry. It's the meter of the lullaby is iambic. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. That time of year thou mayest in me behold this iambic. But that rhythm, I think, is key to song. And of course, there's free verse. There are many forms. Frost says that free verse is like playing tennis without a net. They all work, but even free verse requires something extraordinary in terms of language. So in poetry, you're combining language, meter, song, and metaphor to do something extraordinary, to try to combine experience, it's a seminal art in that respect as well. And I wanted to think more and have more to say about it. But for me, it really is a kind of a mysterious, it just comes from God, I mean, or too much booze or something. But there's a reality to it that occurs. If you, in painting, perhaps it's the same. But there's something that happens there that you really can't explain. You get up with an image. If you don't kick the muse out of bed and you stay with it, and you pursue it and let it work on your imagination and let your mind pull in myriad other elements, then it somehow comes together. The metaphysical poets, I had to draw in the word metaphysical poets, the 17th century poets who were famous for their conceits. I'm sure you all know about this, but the definition of a metaphysical conceit. In English literature, the term is generally associated with the 17th century metaphysical poets, an extension of contemporary usage. In the metaphysical conceit, metaphors have a much more purely conceptual and thus tenuous relationship between the things compared. Helen Gardner observed that a conceit is a comparison whose ingenuity is more striking than its justness, and that a comparison becomes a conceit when we are made to concede likeness while being strongly conscious of unlikeness. An example of the latter would be George Herbert's praise, in which the generosity of God is compared to a bottle which, as we have boxes for the poor, that is money box, will take in an infinite amount of the speaker's tears. An oft-cited example of the metaphysical conceit is the metaphor from John Donne's The Flea, in which the flea that bites both the speaker and his lover becomes a conceit, arguing that his lover has no reason to deny him sexually, although they are not married. And it goes, "Oh stay, 3 lives in 1 flea spare, where we almost, yea more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is." So you mustn't kill the flea, or you kill us and kill our love. My experience with poetry began at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, where I met my partner of 36 years, William Meredith, who was our great poet laureate and Connecticut poet, who died in 2007. And William, our house has become a state landmark, and we've turned it into a kind of mini Yaddo or McDowell colony, where we take artists and writers to come and spend time and trying to support poetry projects, publication projects. And one of my goals is, I think so often when these great ones die, they drop off the planet. You know, you don't hear about them anymore. They're not anthologized. We're always on to the next best thing. And so, I mean, I don't wish to immolate myself on the altar of William Meredith's reputation, but I do want to keep him alive. He was a wonderful man, a pilot, a poet, pilot in World War II and in Korea off of aircraft carriers, beloved teacher at Connecticut College.
Kind soul.
Poet laureate and of the U.S. And he won the Governor's Award for Lifetime Achievement. This was we won't play the whole film, but my new book is called The Revenant. And these are a series of elegies that I wrote the summer William and I were to have gone to Heinrich Boll's cottage in Ireland. It's a writer's retreat. And so I'll try to not have them too dark for you, but let me say this from the introduction. I had accepted an invitation to a writer's retreat in Ireland and wrote a series of elegies entitled Legacy. We were to have gone together, and it was excruciating to be there by myself. Joan Didion describes the grief one experiences that first year when one loses a loved one in her remarkable book, The Year of Magical Thinking. Grief, it turns out, is another country far different from anything one could have imagined. One's expectations and those of family friends do not include the vortex one is drawn into, the emotional collapse that sometimes occurs out of the blue as you walk down the street on a beautiful day or begin to prepare your dinner alone. The constant presence of the loved one's absence threatens to destroy joy forever. The funeral is the easy part. the void in our lives may never abate, time may not, in fact, heal all wounds, and life becomes a question of learning to live with the relentless succession of moments during which we will comfort or confront the experience of meaninglessness itself. I was very impressed by the description of your husband's death. Iris Murdoch has described those moments of suffering as black absolutes, and yet she says, fortunate are those for whom these black stars shed some sort of light. Friends want you to move on like a train pulling out of the station headed toward the next town, a new future. But Paul Bennett has a better metaphor when he says, the one who has died lives on within like the core of a great tree. One adds circles of growth, new life, but the relationship, the history, and the love you've experienced carrying on, sustaining and supporting your life. How could it be otherwise? How could you live and grow if you cut your heart? You need not smash the urn holding your beloved's ashes or lock him up in a framed photograph. I'll read, going back to